Okay, so I want to continue on a little bit with troubleshooting radios and whatnot. And this is a fairly simple problem, but I guess in this radio specifically, and this is a Cobra 2000 GTL, this one sometimes throws some people for a loop because it is an oddball radio. It was really strange the way they designed the power supply circuits in this. In the majority of your radios, your power is switched, or the actual positive. In these radios, the ground circuits, because of this frequency counter clock module, you have to remember when you turn this radio off, the clock's still on. So the power supply is on 24 hours a day, but the radio gets disabled. And the way they accomplish that is ground switching. They don't switch positives, they switch grounds, which can throw some people for a loop. So the problem, this radio has several problems. Most have been fixed now, and a lot of stuff undone. Now the first thing I had to do with the power supply before I even started troubleshooting, as a matter of fact, it was the first thing I did before even replacing the electrolytic capacitors, was to undo all the modifications to that power supply. These power supplies come non-adjustable, which in my opinion, from a tech's point of view, is a good thing. Well, actually, from my point of view, it's a bad thing. But looking at it, as customers, it's good because customers have a bad habit of turning, or I guess you could say golden screwdrivers, of turning the voltage up. And that's exactly what somebody did. They made it partially adjustable and changed a bunch of values. So let me dig them out here. Here's a bunch of the parts that they had in there. They had this trimmer pot. Actually, don't mind that. But a couple resistors changed. And the net result was the power supply was putting out like 16.8 or 16.9 volts. Way too much for this radio. One thing, the customer noted was, change the lights, there's meter lights out, and, well, that would explain it. You've got 12-volt light bulbs. They're designed to be run at 13.8, but everything's been running at, around 16.8 volts. Another problem was the channel display, which you can see is partially illuminated. That's a whole other problem, and that's part of that ground loop problem. When light bulbs start to go out, you get this afterglow because of the way the ground system's set up in this. But anyhow, the other problem was these display digits I actually changed. Both of these 7-segment displays, I had to replace those because they had been replaced before with much smaller ones, so the digits were too small. As you can see, they work just fine now. But if I had to take a guess, the reason they were probably had to have been replaced before was because they burned out because they were running at too high a voltage. Now that's something people seem to forget. When they crank the power supplies up in these radios to try and get more power out of them, RF power out, they seem to forget that you're running the entire radio at that increased voltage now. So circuits that were designed to run at a specific voltage are now running at much higher voltages, and things like light bulbs and display digits and God knows what else will easily burn out, because especially like capacitors, electrolytic capacitors in a lot of radios, they run they kind of run those borderline close to operating voltage. Well, when you go bumping up the power supply an extra 3 volts, you're taking that capacitor that was all right, if at 13.8 volts, is now, that's just too much for it, and it's very short-lived. But in any case, the problem with this one now, and it was a problem that the customer had noted, was when he keyed the microphone, the lights would get dim, at least the lights that work. So I want to check the power supply voltage. Now I've already recapped the radio, so I know all the electrolytic capacitors are good, output power is fine. Overall condition, the radio's back to good condition now. But there is still a problem. So what I want to show is I have, and this is where, like I say, this runs a switched ground. So you'll notice I have 2 sets of test leads. There's 2 reds and there's 2 blacks. Now I have the black lead here going, and one red going to 1 meter, and the other black and red going to another meter. And what those are is, this one's picking up board ground for the radio. So this negative is attached to the DC ground on this board. The ground for the other radio is picking up directly at the bridge rectifier. So the negative terminal in the bridge rectifier is where this one's picking up ground. And then both positives are attached to the exact same point on the power supply board, which is the output voltage. So if we look up at the 2 meters, so it's off right now, and if I turn the radio on, you can see we have 13.64 volts right there, and that's the one where the ground right here is attached to the bridge rectifier, so right at the power supply. And the meter down here, the negative, is attached to DC board ground. Now watch what happens when I key the microphone. You can see the meter up here did not change. I unkey the microphone, key the microphone, absolutely nothing. Rock steady 13.64 volts. But if you look down here at this one, you can see it's bouncing all over the place, and it drops drastically. You know, what, a volt or more, and audio. If I put it in the sideband, audio. See, it drops even farther. Now, like I say, this is what can throw a lot of people for a loop, because they'll check DC voltage here and everything looks fine. Or they'll check voltage, like I say, it's where you're taking your measurements from. You got to be careful because of that switch supply with the switch DC ground. So if we look at that on the schematic here, okay, so here's our bridge rectifier. Here's the output, the positive, okay, it goes through the, okay, and out, and then the other lead here, this is the ground. So here's a filter cap, but here's the main, that's the main filter cap on the underside, which actually that's, I always increase those to 10,000 microfarads, so that's now a 10,000 instead of a 4,700. But if you follow that, that's the ground, okay? So that goes to the power supply, and that's on all the time, okay? But you'll see, you follow down here, that goes down to the power switch, okay, and turns on and off. So what that switching is the DC ground. But notice there's another ground here, and this is the one for the clock module. So like I say, it's a really weird system the way they switch ground, not the positive. So it's fairly simple to deduce what the problem is here. If the voltage isn't changing at here, so if we hook up a basically, you know, meter probe, because I have one meter hooked up basically from here to here, directly across the bridge rectifier, or actually from here to the output of this transistor, the voltage regulator circuit, and the voltage does not change between here and here. But when I hook up a meter from here to the actual ground on the radio, the voltage drops. That means that leaves only one thing in that path, the power switch. So if I key the microphone again, we look up here at this bottom meter. So this is the one that's hooked up to the DC board ground. If I key the microphone, let me put it back in AM. You can see it's dropped. Now watch what happens when I actually just push in on the switch a little bit. Voltage went up. I let out on it, jumps around. I'm going to turn it off and back on. See, it's at 12.9. If I touch the switch, push it in some, 13, it's going up. I pushed it in a little bit farther, it's up to 13.4. Okay, turn it off, turn it back on. You know, 12.8, I push the switch. So, yeah, the switch. And that's actually a common problem in these, and it's missed by a lot of people, is this power switch going bad. So just something to be aware of when you're troubleshooting. You know, look for simple things like that. Just because voltage is measuring okay here or from here to here doesn't mean that the rest of the radio's voltages are fine. Because in the case of this one, they use this two separate grounds, one for the clock module and then another one that supplies power to the main radio chassis, and the culprit is that power switch. So I'll pop it off the board and try cleaning it. If that doesn't do any good, I'll just go ahead and replace it. But just be aware of things like that when you're troubleshooting power supply circuits. A lot of times, if it's something that has something like this, has a clock, if it has something that stays on all the time, that means the power supply is always going to be on. So something's switching on, you know, there's a something's supplying power to this all the time, and then it also supplies power to this. But in most electronics, you'll find the red or your positive being switched, not the ground. This one is just a really weird setup. Like I say, it's an oddball, and that's also part of the reason you get this. I guess that shows up in the camera. But the radio's off now, and you can still read the digits. Even though the radio's not turned on, you can still see, and that's in what I call the Cobra 2000 afterglow. It's also common if you replace these meter lights with LEDs, you also get that afterglow. That's because those meter lights are actually absorbing, there's a little bit of floating power. Matter of fact, if you notice the voltmeter, when I turned the radio off, it was still measuring like 2 volts off of the power supply circuit here. Well, that's part of the problem. That's part of the reason why this stinking displays come on. And that's a whole nother conversation, the afterglow in these things. But there you go. I just wanted to show troubleshooting. You know, a lot of people might think there's a problem with the power supply, and I've seen people do that. Replace literally all of the components in the power supply. The bridge rectifier, the transistor, you know, all the transistors. Matter of fact, there's an FET on there. Even go as far as think, well, maybe it's the power regulators over here, maybe it's this voltage regulator, when the problem the whole time was the power switch. So just be aware of things like that before you go loading a bunch of semiconductors into the end of your shotgun barrel and blowing them at your piece of equipment. It could be something as simple as maybe dirty contacts in a power switch that you can clean, or it does need to be replaced. But just keep an eye out for little things like that.